All right, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Chris Way. I'm an SEL coach here in the MSD of Wayne Township. I want to welcome you guys to our first annual Social Emotional Behavioral Wellness Blitz. For those of you that this might be your first session, thank you for being with us today. We're very hopeful that you are going to walk away with a lot of valuable information. Just a few housekeeping bits. We're going to keep everybody muted throughout the presentation, and we'll utilize the question and answer feature for any questions you may have. I'll leave it for Mr. Vanderbush if he'll entertain questions throughout his presentation. Otherwise, we'll save some time at the end to ask and answer those questions. Also, at the end of the session, we'll have a link and a QR code so that you could provide feedback for the presenter as well as for the conference overall. So if you could fill that out, that'd be very much appreciated. Feedback is definitely a gift. So now I am pleased to introduce to you Mr. Kevin Vanderbush.
When I was back in the early 90s teaching, I had a student named Ben. Ben was one of those kids that didn't have a father around. Mother was very sick. There wasn't much money at home. Ben was the kind of kid we took up, collections for groceries, gave him lunch money. But he was just a really hard worker, a great. And, Ben made himself into a football player, made himself into a good student. Ben got both an academic and need scholarship to Rose-Hulman. And the problem with that was that when he got to Rose-Hulman, he realized he didn't have any money for books. So what Ben did was he would go to the other kids in the class and he would ask them when they were going to be using their books so that he could read their books at a time that they weren't. He graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering, a minor in biomedical engineering, and did very well for himself. He's the kind of kid that kept up with me. I shoot me an email every once in a while, just how I was doing. And he was just that type of kid. When my son died 8 years ago, he made a special trip to check in on me, came to a football game, left a college reunion to do that. About 3 years ago, I kept getting these pictures, the one you see up on the slide here. He knew I wanted to live in a lake house someday. So he said, "You got to come visit me." So for 3 years, I kept getting these texts and these pictures. And to be honest with you, as busy as I am in the summer, it was really tough with the idea of traveling 3 hours there, 3 hours back. But finally, last summer, I took the trip. And when I got there, Ben introduced me to his wife. And the first thing she said to me, she goes, "I figured you were going to walk on water." And she's like, "He has told everybody in town that you were coming." And about that time, I felt pretty bad for taking 3 years to get up there. But Ben showed me around. I'd asked him, "Show me your place of business," and so forth, because he started an orthopedic tool company. He had some rental properties. So he took me around and, it was really kind of neat. I mean, he's living this really big house on the lake. He's got a multi-million-dollar company that he owns. He owns rental properties. And that alone would be, really pretty cool to see a kid who came from nothing to make something of himself. But what really spoke to me was that when I went to his place of business, he didn't want to talk about the patents he had and the other things that were going on. What he wanted to tell me was, he goes, "I am paying it forward." He says, "I know what you did for me when I was in high school, the way you guys, gave me money for groceries for lunch." He said, "So what I've done is," he said, I've bought tires for one of my employees. I paid fees." And he went through a laundry list of things that he's done for his employees, because he said, "I know what you guys did for me and I want to pay that forward." We got to his rental properties. He didn't want to talk about them, what they're worth, anything like that. But he turned to me, he said, "I tried to get my father back in my life. I brought him up here on these things." And he said, he lasted for a day. He said, "People have asked me," he said, "how does it feel not to have, a father in your life like that?" And he turned to me and he goes, "I tell them I had people like you. You were my father figure in high school." He said, "You have given me all that I needed in terms of that." When we got done looking around, at his business, at his rental properties, he went out in the lake and kayaked and came back in, smoked some ribs, and we used the microwave and I put it on 50% power, and he looked at me like I was, speaking a different language. And I was thinking, what do they teach mechanical engineers these days? Because he had no idea what that was. Later on, we went out on the boat and we talked about life. We talked about, I suggested to him that he was spending too much time on his rental properties and he needs to spend time with his kids because they aren't going to be there forever. I also told him, I said, you need to make sure that you're developing your relationship with your wife, date your wife. And I also, being a strength coach, said, hey, Ben, I taught you better than this 25 years ago. We need to lose a little bit of weight. Well, about 2 months later, I get a text from Ben. He was excited about the visit and everything, but he had to tell me, he goes, Coach, I've lost 16 pounds. He said, the rental properties are up for sale. And he said, I've got a special date planned with my wife, and I finally learned how to use the microwave. He said, you're still having an impact on me. When my son did die, I had a number of students reach out to me. One that really resonated with me was a student who started the email out with, you won't remember me. And he said, I was in a class of 70 kids. I wasn't a very good athlete. I didn't say much. I said, but I wanted to let you know the impact that you've had on my life. And he went into talk about role modeling. He talked about the structure, the discipline, the way I dealt with people. And he goes, I tried to use what I learned from you in high school in the way that I raised my kids. And, it was a very heartfelt email. And one of those things that really spoke to me in terms of how we influence kids, even when we don't know it. A kid like that, just the role modeling itself, that when you're in education, you have an opportunity to make a difference. And what I tell people is that in education, whatever area of education you're in, you're basically planting trees. And, we only get to see basically the seedling. But, for me, this was 25 years later. It was a result of a tragedy, but those two things are a reason that I got to see, how he impacted those two kids. And I'm not talking about just, this isn't, hey, look at me. This is, look what we do as educators, as people who are involved in education and do these things, the impact that we can have on lives. Now, when I was younger, you could not pay me to read. And in fact, my dad tried to. He was an educator. As I got into the field of strength and conditioning, I started reading everything I could on exercise science and just loved it. I mean, just, thought it was the greatest thing. But then I realized as I get into teaching, I got into coaching, that was the content was very limited in terms of what I had to work with. And I realized that every area of personal development is something that I need to study. So I started studying psychology, motivation, leadership, relationships, communication. And as I read in those areas, I realized the interconnectedness in everything that I do, whether it's teaching, whether it's coaching, whether it's dealing with kids in terms of being a counselor to them. And I understood the importance of all of that. So, what I tell people now is this. When I first started teaching, I basically, in my toolbox, I had a hammer. And everything was based on that hammer. But as I've read, I had a student ask me recently, and I've read 500 books in the last 20 years. And by having all of those, I basically have what's on the right there, a toolbox to where there are a number of different things that come up. When I first started and I'm just in the exercise science mode, I don't handle the kid who I just had 2 weeks ago when I'm talking to him and I said, hey, how you doing? How'd your summer go? And he goes, well, I had some family problems. And I come to find out from the kid that he just realized 2 weeks ago that his father was not his natural father. And that, and that he even, to make it even tougher on him, he found out that he was basically conceived as a result of a rape. You don't have those tools to talk with a kid like that, to work through it with him when you are just starting, if you don't, get out and experience much more than just the basics within your content area. And I tell people, if you stick in your content area, you stick with just, one lane, your toolbox just becomes a lot of different hammers. You don't have all of those different tools you need in order to really be successful in working with people. Read this book recently, and I'll throw a lot of books up here. And what I do is when I read, I will highlight and then I will type up the highlights, because for me, it's a deeper learning. Plus, sometimes I use them in presentations. Sometimes I just pass on the notes because I've got teachers or coaches or people that I know who won't read a book, but they'll read my notes. But in this book, it talks about the importance of having such a broad range of experiences, of abilities, and so forth, as opposed to somebody who just studies within their content. Another good one to have during this pandemic, and I've given this a few other people, is the idea of neutral thinking. The guy has written something that, basically, most people think of just kind of pessimist, optimist, one end to the continuum to the other, but this guy talks about that middle ground. And one of the important points that he makes is that, basically in life, when we have different things happen, both good or bad, that, we need to look at it as a comma as opposed to a period. We need to think about it in terms of, as we move forward in the sentence, do we write the sentence ourselves or do we let other people write it for us? But he's got a lot of good thoughts in that book. People ask me, well, how do you read so much? To me, what I realize is if I've always got a book with me, that there is always time to read. So many of us get on, they get on the phone, get on the computer, get on the internet, and we waste time. We're clicking here and there, we're reading little bits of things, and it's not really productive. And I have found that by having a book with me at all times, it allows me the opportunity to read through the day that I wouldn't otherwise. The two things that I think influence you the most are what you read and who you read. And, I would say this, when I got into education, I realized very quickly not to head to the staff lounge because I felt like it was a very toxic environment. Even when I was doing my student teaching, there were teachers that were trying to talk me out of being an educator. But I have found that if I hang around with people who are willing to challenge me, who are willing to be straightforward with me, they're willing to say, hey, have you thought about this? Or, what you're doing right here, I don't think is the right way to go about it, that I grow. But if I just hang around with people that we can sit and complain about what we do and so forth, that I'm not really growing as an educator. When I work with and try to mentor younger teachers, younger coaches, I talk to them about, 30 years from now. Most of them look at me like I have three eyes, like, why would I be thinking that far ahead? But for me, what I would say is this, I think everyone needs to be thinking about where do I want to be? Where do I want to go? Because if you don't, then you don't really take the steps necessary in order to get there. But I also think that people need to think in terms of, okay, 30 years from now, what do I want to have accomplished? Because without thinking ahead and saying, okay, what do I want my career, life, et cetera, to stand for? I don't think you, again, take the steps necessary in order to get to that point. When you ask 90-year-olds, what are the top three things you would have done differently? First one is reflect more, enjoy more moments. The second one was take more risks and chances. And even somebody 90 is saying life is short. But I think one that, really sticks with me in terms of education is that you leave a legacy. Okay, something to live on after you die. And I think as educators, you have that opportunity to leave a legacy through the people that you have impacted. Now, to me, people talk about being passionate about their career, passionate about teaching, whatever it is. To me, passion is an emotion, and the problem with being an emotion is that it wanes up and down. It's not like every single day as an educator, you can come into your job and say, I'm just full of energy, I'm passionate and really ready to go. But the thing that you can bring with you every day is your purpose. If you have an understanding of why you're there, I think that every day you can be in that mode. For me, it's using strength and conditioning as a platform to change lives and teach life lessons. I learned very quickly that it's not about my content. It's not just about strength and conditioning. I love strength and conditioning, but it's more about changing lives and teaching life lessons. So when things happen, I am looking in terms of what my purpose is as opposed to what my content is. I think people who get burned out teaching and education is because they forget why they do it. I did this presentation to our staff, and then the principal asked me to do it to our school staff. And, I had a teacher, come approach me and she said, it really resonated with me because I'm getting burnt out. So I shared with her this book, and, John Gordon's a great writer. He's got a lot of different books out. A lot of businesses use his books, but she read it and she goes, that was very good. I needed to hear that. I needed to hear, that I needed to get back to why it was that I got into it, being an educator. For me, I got a very short ride to school because I believe strongly that I need to live close to where I work. But each day I start my day with saying this, put in front of me those I can mentor, counsel, advise, and give me the words to say to make a difference. By starting my day in this way, then that means that I'm looking for those opportunities. So throughout the day, if I've got, busy with something and some kid comes up to me, some adult comes up to me, whatever it is, then it's kind of like, oh, this may be that person that I'm supposed to have an influence on. And by starting a day with this goal in mind, I find that it opens me up to the opportunities throughout the day. And there's so many times that I'm sitting there having a conversation, counseling a student, talking with an adult, that I'm like, okay, this is who I'm supposed to be talking to. I think what is also important is that you have some type of self-reflection. At the end of the day, it's got to be, okay, did I take advantage of those opportunities that I had? Were there positives throughout the day that, make me feel good about this? Is there something I need to do differently? But I also think it's good to write down the positives. So many of us, I think, get bogged down by those negatives that happen, throughout the day, that we forget all those things that happen positively. I think especially for younger teachers, it's a good idea to keep a journal of the things that you accomplish throughout the day. So when you do have those days when it just seems like, am I getting anything done? You can refer back to, oh yeah, okay, I did this, I did that. I think even in your relationships with your spouse, it would be a good idea to write down those things about your spouse that you appreciate, because then you start looking at them with a different lens. And I think you look at your job with a different lens by looking and being more positive, so that, the negatives don't outweigh things. For some people, in terms of, with a spouse, it actually could be the best gift you ever give your spouse, a list of all those things that you found positive about them. When kids send thank you letters, to you as a teacher, as a coach, and so forth, what you find is that it has nothing to do with what you taught, the content. It has everything to do with the relationships that you built. It has to do with how you affected them in some way. The times you stopped and talked to them, the times that you helped them out with different life decisions. And I think you have to understand that as a teacher, as an educator, as someone, who's working with children, working with adults, that it is not. Yes. Somebody say Mr. Vanderbush? Oh, okay. All right. To me, society says success is about money. Success is, in my realm, about state championships, is about things like that. But I think that as an educator, you need to look more at significance, being significant as opposed to successful. There are a lot of people, I think, that look at their job, journey as I need to keep moving up, I need to keep going somewhere else, and so forth, as opposed to saying, I need to be significant where I am. For me, there are two questions I think everybody should ask themselves. One is, you ask your colleagues, does he love his job? If your colleagues, say, does it look like I love my job? And you don't, I think you need to examine that. And for me as a teacher, it's like, what would it be like to be taught by me? I feel like it's important that I am teaching in a way that I would want my children to have as a teacher. And I think you need to constantly ask yourself those two questions. After I get done giving this presentation to our township staff, a teacher recommended this book to me, and it was really a good book. It had some good points. And the first one was that 85% of people, and the data that she had interviewed, could recall a school incident from their childhood that was so shaming it changed how they thought of themselves as learners. But also in that same data, that 90% of the people could name a teacher, coach, school administrator, or faculty member who reinforced their self-worth and helped them believe in themselves and their ability, which to me says that we have such an enormous power and influence, and how we use that power and influence changes people for better or worse. This is a book that was written a long time ago, and I constantly refer to it because I think so many people, regardless of what profession you're in, think of the big time as something out there that they just can't grasp, that it's beyond where they are at this point. And I think it's very important that wherever you are, you make it the big time. For me, as a strength and conditioning coach, I don't look at college strength and conditioning coaches, professional and so forth, as being the big time. I look at where I am, making the school that I'm working in the big time. I work with a lot of difficult students. We're at, anybody that's in Wayne Township knows we're at basically 100% free and reduced lunch with the grants that we get. There are kids that come in here with issues, but I feel like that by looking at my job in the way that I do, that I can like where I am better than any other position that I could have. I think, some people don't understand that the grass is always greener, but the grass is greener where you water, where you tend to it. Now, I could make a list of the reasons why my job is difficult or why I should look somewhere else, and I think really everybody could make those lists. You give it a long laundry list of things that you find that they're difficult, but I think what you have to decide is whether you look at those things as obstacles or you look at them as challenges. And for me, it's kind of like being a problem solver. Throw something at me that's difficult, and I'll look for a way to try to improve upon it. And I think people have to understand that some days you got a lot more negatives than positives, and you got to respond to them and be resilient in a positive manner rather than let them grind you down. My favorite quote in the world is that life is a grindstone. Whether it polishes you up or grinds you down depends on the stuff you are made of. And I think it's important that we look at the different things that we face in that way. You know, when my grandson had some binoculars and looking at the long way, I started thinking about visuals. And I really think it's probably would be a bad idea for everybody to have a small set of binoculars sitting on their desk to remind them that in the upper left-hand corner, that's how you need to look at the positive things in your life, you know, where you blow them up, they become closer. In the bottom right is how you need to look at the negatives, the difficulties, where you look at them in a way that really it shrinks them up. It makes them smaller. You know, I'm big on the idea of setting the bar high. I've always had high expectations for the students that I work with. However, I don't see that setting the bar high is the same as, you know, going to an amusement park where it's like, if you don't reach this height, you know, then you can't take the ride. For me, the way I look at it is this. For some kids, I'm going to have to give them heel lifts to get up to where I want to. For some kids, I'm going to have to give them a step stool. And for some kids, I'm going to have to give them a ladder. So that I have to come up with ways that people can reach that high bar that I have set for them. Good book by Dan Heath that talks about solving problems. But one of the key points that he had in here that I thought was good. You know, as educators, we look at data all the time. And I think there's a difference between data for the purpose of inspection, which I think a lot of people is just inspecting, you know, through data versus data for the purpose of learning. You know, how will the data that we collect be used to improve teaching? And I think if we aren't using data to improve teaching, then it doesn't make any sense to even collect the data. To make sure that you understand that that's the purpose of that. I'm going to, again, showing you a lot of books here. There's a book, Make Your Bed. William McCraven, he's got a great commencement speech. You can look it up on YouTube. We put it into a book and add some things to it. And rather than going through each one of these points, it's basically that he's talking about the little things that you do on a daily basis at the start of your day and how that affects the rest of your day and how that can make such a difference. And he used the idea of making the bed in the morning, and he attributed that to, you know, kind of his start in the military. But what I would say is this: when I'm talking about, you know, changing a culture in a school, for me, you know, using his kind of thought process, for me, it's in order to change a culture in a school, it's about picking up the trash. You know, when we had a coach from Penn State who's recruiting one of our players, came into our school, and he's walking down our halls and he picks up the trash and throws something away. Automatically, I'm looking at this guy thinking, that's a quality guy. I would love to have one of our kids play for him. You know, when I had a visitor from another school visit our program, we had a fire drill and we went outside. On the way back in, he's picking up the trash. Again, it's like, that's a quality guy. When you talk about guys like John Wood and Tony Dungy, who are people that I respect highly, you know, when you read about them, they were the kind of guys that stopped and picked up the trash. And to me, if you come into school with the idea of, I'm going to pick up the trash, okay, what it means is this: you've got humility. You're not too good for any task. I've actually talked with custodial staff because my kids have kind of worked custodial when they were going through school. And there are teachers who don't feel like it's their job to pick up the trash on the floor in the room, which I don't understand. I mean, you should not be, you know, too good for any task. To me, it says something about how you feel about the school. Selflessness. I don't care who dropped it. I didn't put it there. You know, I walk around the school picking up trash. I don't care, you know, who did it. I feel like, you know, I feel good about the fact that I'm making a difference in that capacity. You have pride in your school. I had kids say, well, why do you keep picking up the trash? And I said, because it's my school. And, you know, I think some of that rubs off on them, because then I start seeing some kids who are taking more pride in the facilities. But I think it's also about doing the right thing, regardless of whether or not you're being noticed for it. You know, having a time during the day where you're doing something that's being productive, I think leads to others. Just like the Make Your Bed concept, doing the right thing throughout your school, it's like, even if other things are going poorly, I'm making a difference here. And it starts allowing you to look at other things you do throughout the day in a more positive way. So to me, if you want to change the school culture, start off by picking up the trash. To me, making changes is a 3-step process. Okay, the first step is, what is it that's bothering me? You know, most people want to make changes in their life, but you've got to really determine what it is that's bothering you. And the second thing is, it's something I could fix. When I talk with students, a lot of times I'm talking about, you know, the way that, you know, their parents, their teachers, their coaches. And it's like, okay, do you think you're going to change the way they do things? Do you think you're going to change them? And most often it's no, you know, they realize they aren't. So I said, the only thing that you can really change is the way that you view that. And we get into that discussion about that. But for some people, it may be weight control, it may be exercise, it may be some of these other things that they talk to me about. And, I say, okay, is this something you can fix? But the third part, I think, is the most important, is, are you actually willing to fix it? Because when people come to me and ask for advice about making change, I go through and make sure that we've covered all three of these steps. Because if I want to change, I want to make a difference, I've got to make sure that I understand that in order for that to happen, I've got to be willing to fix it and willing to take those steps necessary for that to happen. I think it's important that all of us learn the whole delayed versus instant gratification. People who are successful understand that. I go back to that marshmallow experiment that they did a number of years ago, where they put kids in front of the marshmallow, and if you're able to wait 15 minutes, you get a second one. But if you eat it right away, you only get the one. And, a lot of their data from back then, showed that those kids who were willing to wait were much more successful, SAT scores, college, and so forth. Now, I will say this, in the book Range, which is much more recent, they did some more of these follow-up studies and found that there wasn't quite the correlation now as there was back then. And again, even just that, tells me that, boy, I need to have a broad range of reading rather than just kind of assume that some other data or some other research that I've read is the end all, because things can change. I think it's important that we all understand that we have a limited supply of mental energy and willpower, which over the course of the day becomes depleted. When you look at Twitter research, what they say is that in the beginning of the day, things are much more positive than they are at the end of the day. By the end of the day, things have gotten much more negative. When you look at judges' decisions, when people go into court, they find that they're much more lenient early in the day, much more likely to give parole. By the end of the day, they've kind of worn out, and it's much more strict. So I think it's important that you look for opportunities throughout your day to get rid of some of those things that are, to me, wasted opportunities in terms of willpower, in terms of mental decisions. So for me, it's this. I start my day every day with 30 minutes on an exercise bike and reading and highlighting books. In that 30-minute habit that I have, which I don't have to think about because I just automatically do. Over the course of a year, it means it's 20 pounds I haven't gained. It's 10 books I've read. I read it other times, but this is just something I do at the beginning of the day that starts my day off right. It's a habit. I don't have to think about it. Now, for me, I even take it steps further, and some people think I'm a little bit crazy, but as a strength and conditioning coach, I don't have to worry about some of the apparel that some of you other people do, but I have 12 pairs of the same sweatpants. So when I get up in the morning, I just put them on and I just go right down the line and with a different t-shirt. And I don't have to think about what I'm wearing. I eat the same breakfast and I eat the same lunch every day. I know how many calories are in it. I know it'll give me enough fuel for the day, and I don't have to think about it, so that I have more of that capacity later on to really deal with the decisions that are much more important than, those minor things. But I think it's all about developing habits. I think that people who develop habits don't have to think about the things that they do. And these are two great books that I would recommend to everyone. They really kind of break it down into what the little things that you do on a daily basis, making those decisions, can have such a big influence on your life. The way I express it to the people that I talk to is this: you have a goal, and typically the goal is like in this picture, all the way around the corner where you can't see it. And throughout, the time each day, you are able to basically take baby steps. So for somebody that's trying to lose weight, for instance, each day they have an opportunity to exercise, they have an opportunity to watch what they're eating, hydrate, and so forth. So each one of those things that they do in a positive manner is a baby step in the right direction. But for a lot of people, because the goal is so far off, because they can't see it, it's like, well, the little baby steps that they take in the wrong direction really won't mean that much. And, as I deal with athletes, I talk about the challenge of, trying to get to a certain point. And, all these things, for them, I'll talk about eating right, sleeping right, and a number of those different things that they decide on a daily basis whether to do or not are really giving them the steps forward in order to achieve their goals. Revert, since this is a whole life lessons, it's kind of a menagerie here, but I'm going to revert to relationships. Yes, my grandson on the left there. I have a neat picture when he was on the playground. But when I talk to my students who want to get married, the first thing I tell them is I said that, love is a choice, not an emotion. You will never fall out of love. If you're going to keep within your marriage, you have to stick with your commitment, because it's basically love is a choice, and you've got to choose to continue to find a way to make that happen. The best visual to me for relationships, whether it's with a spouse or whether it's with your children, is this. I heard somebody say this once where they said, it was a wife talking to her husband who happened to say, you treat your job like a 5-course meal. It's a lot of nice talking, it's communication, it's laughing, it's taking your time, it's high energy. But when you come home to me, all I get are the leftovers. And I really think with a lot of us, we pour so much into our career that at times, the people that are most important to us, we only really have the leftovers for. And I think it's important that we kind of, switch it to where we understand the importance of taking care of those people that are the most important in our lives. And these to me are the relationship builders. First of all, to play the mercy game. And this is when I talk about relationship builders, it's with the students or people you work with, it's with colleagues, it's with your spouse, whatever it is. The mercy game is this. Most people, when things happen, like somebody shows up late to something, assume that they just didn't care about the time enough to find it important. You play the mercy game, what you say is that, they got caught in traffic, maybe they had a rough day, things probably aren't going their way. Or, when you get home and, the house is a wreck or whatever, and somebody's saying, well, gosh, don't you care about this? Again, did somebody have a rough day? But if you look at that in terms of the people that you're dealing with, where you kind of look at the positive or think about the things that could have gone wrong, you look at things much differently and you don't, light the fuse too quickly. I think it's important that when you're dealing with people, you don't bring up the past. You deal with issues as they happen. You don't use the term always or never, because you deal, again, with what's right in front of you. Give people an opportunity to change. But I think this is one of the most important things. When you're talking with people or having a discussion, so often people want to give their side, or they want to speak about, or counter whatever it is that someone's saying. But if you get in the habit of summarizing or restating what the person has just told you, then what happens is that you learn how to listen better. You let the person know that you've been listening, but also as you're summarizing or restating, that person has the opportunity to say to you, no, that wasn't really what I was trying to say. It was something different. But if you get into that habit, you'll find that discussions are much more productive. It's not just about you trying to get your 2 cents in. And sometimes I think you just have to learn to listen. So many times that when we are communicating in a relationship that we want to do the talking, but it has to be about listening. And I think it's important for all of us that we remember to date our spouse, no matter how old we are, how many years we've been married. But it's important that you continue to do that. I think it should be a requirement for all people who are married, the 5 love languages, which means, it's basically that you understand the difference between the way people can be loved and are loved, and not just how you want people to react to you, but how you react to them can be different. Talking about kids, okay? With kids, I think parenting, as an educator, we need to notice what
ruin everything
with certain parenting styles.
They're like broke little best friends.
Okay, all kids are different, even if raised the same. I don't know if I'm supposed to be getting that audio or not. All kids are different, even if they're raised the same. Don't fight their battles, let them go first. Even as educators, I have found that I'll have different teachers who will come to me and start talking about their son or their daughter. And I don't get that, because to me, I would like to be able to talk to the student first. I'd like the student to learn how to come and express their opinion and ask questions and so forth. And I think it's important as parents and as educators that we don't kind of take advantage of the position that we're in, and we let our kids grow up. I think you need to use tough love. I think we need to raise with the end in mind. Okay, as we're raising children, we are really raising adults. We're not really raising children. And I think we need to give them the opportunity to fail. It's better that they become strong rather than always kept safe. Angela Duckworth has got a great book, Grit. I think all educators should read it. I will tell you again that in the book Range, she talked about some of the things a little bit different from what she had expressed. But I think in terms of raising children and having them go through where they have to stick some things out, I think helps set the tone for how successful they will be later on. I think it's another good book that's a writer that's very similar to a Malcolm Gladwell, if you've ever read some of his books, but How to Raise an Adult. It's got a lot of good thoughts in it. For me, as now a grandparent, I realize right away, first of all, that I can't judge people until I'm in their shoes. I am the type of grandparent that I used to make fun of. If you looked on my phone, I probably have about 3,000 pictures. And any time that I get an opportunity to spend with my grandchild, I will. But I will also tell you this, that it's also another reason to exercise. When I get to this age and my grandson wants to jump on my shoulders, I would feel bad if I had not kept up physically to where I couldn't do that. I couldn't go chase him. I couldn't crawl under the table with him and do those things. But I think you realize as a grandparent how quickly the 18 years go by as a parent. And during those 18 years, you are younger, where you're dealing with a number of other stresses that you have to deal with at that time. And you don't learn how to enjoy the moment. And I would just say to people who have kids at home still, that, it's real easy to say, okay, there's 18 years, but I would tell you this, that anyone who is in the position of being a grandparent looks back and says, that time flew by. Make sure you take advantage of the little moments rather than always looking forward. Randy Pausch, professor who was dying of pancreatic cancer, gave this last lecture, but he also wrote a book about it. And he's got some good points. We can't change the cards that we're dealt with, just how we play the hand. Okay. And the other thing I really like from him is the idea of brick walls. People talk about the walls that are put in front of them. And, for some people it's, okay, this is preventing me from doing something. But, what he talks about is brick walls are there to stop the people who don't want it bad enough and to really show you how bad you want something. And I really think that's a key point there. For me, what I have found with having dealt with, having my oldest son die 8 years ago, that I've learned some things, about that process, and that when we use things from our life, I think that kind of be vulnerable. I think it allows you to be better at who you are. I've dealt with, since that time, with a lot of kids who have dealt with death in their families, adults who've dealt with death in their families. But by being open to some of the steps that I've gone through, I think that I've been able to use a tragedy in my life to help make me a better person and help those around me. So what I've come up with is there's 3 steps when dealing with death. The first is that you grieve. And I think everybody needs to go through that, or they don't really move forward. The second thing is I think you need to find a way to celebrate the life, of the person, who has passed. But the third thing that I think most people have the most difficulty with is I think you need to honor the individual by carrying on what you have gained from knowing them. By looking at what they have done in your life, or how they have made you better, or even how the instances that, even led to the death, or whatever it is. I think if you look at that in terms of how does this make me a better individual, then later on, you're not that person who, is every year for 20 years later, still the anniversary of the death becomes a point of grief and so forth. But instead, you learn how to look at those different dates as an opportunity to remember this person in a positive light. So you also, I think the important thing is, how would you want others to go on if things were in reverse? And I think for some people that kind of allows them to look at things differently. I think one of the things that, I think is very important is the John Wooden maximum about helping people who cannot help you in any way. And I'm really big on the idea of mentoring. When I get younger coaches, younger teachers, I want to be able to share with them. And I hope that younger teachers look at the opportunity to look to the people that have been around a while, to kind of pick their brain and say, hey, what do I need to know? What have you picked up that I should know that would help make me better? I'm going to get into exercise. I don't know if you knew who I was before you signed up for this, but I am the strength coach at Ben Davis High School. So you're going to get a little bit of a talk about exercise. Yeah, that's my other grandson. Dumbbell rattles are the gift, of course, that a strength coach will give to babies when they're born, whether it's my kids or the athletes that I have to grow up. Daniel Pink, I think, said it about as well as I've seen it written. And I won't read this entire thing. You could read it later if you want to, but the positive effects of exercise. But his bottom line is that people would be silly not to do it. There are so many positive things about mental and physical changes that occur as a result of exercise. But these are just some basic general guidelines that I would give you. First of all, I would say this: don't look at exercise as a punishment for what you eat, but look at it as a positive thing for the things that you were able to do. And people look at me and say, well, by the end of the day, this is what I am. This is on my back deck. I thought I'm just bound to use this in a presentation somehow. People feel like this at the end of the day. And what I ask you is this: if you, for instance, if you weigh 20 pounds more than you'd like to weigh, just take one day where you put a backpack on that weighs 20 pounds. walk around with it throughout the day, the entire day, and see if your joints are hurting a little bit more, you have less energy, you're a little bit more irritable, and think about it in reverse. Okay, if that's how I feel by carrying around those extra 20 pounds, how would I feel if I took those 20 pounds off? I would also say this: if you look at people who are consistent with their exercise, they seem to, even though that they take the time to exercise, seem to have more energy, and really they do. So for exercise, my suggestions: one is develop a habit before worrying about the volume. So many people think that they need to get to where they hope to be eventually right from the start. It's more about 10 minutes a day, 3 days a week, going for a walk. Something like that is just going to get you in the idea that I've started to become a person that exercises. You give yourself a minimum. You just say, okay, regardless of what happens throughout the week, I'm going to go out, these days, or I'm going to do this amount of work. Put it on the calendar and schedule it. Don't wait to see how you feel. If you wait till, okay, am I going to feel like working out today? It isn't going to happen. Exercise should be personality driven. As somebody like myself who likes lifting weights, I don't understand, how anybody would not like lifting weights, but in a way, but I do understand, because there are a lot of people that don't like doing it. Find the type of exercise that you enjoy. Some people, it's individual. Some people, they have to be in groups. Some people need all kinds of variety. Some people need things the same. So I think you need to find out, okay, think about what your personality is. What are the things that I need to do that would allow me to continue on with that? But you should basically include some type of resistance training. It could be body weight, it could be bands, it could be lifting weights, it could be machines, some type of cardio work, and some type of things to make sure that you maintain your range of motion. Now, I've noticed this in schools especially. Somebody puts out some food, that there are so many people that take food, regardless of what time of day it is, regardless of whether they've eaten anything. And staff meetings that happen after lunch, there's food put out where people eat automatically, regardless of whether they're hungry. There's something about the idea of free food that just lights something up in people's brain, the idea that I have to eat. And that's something that I think we need to change. Dieting and lifestyle changes. You've got to decide that it's important enough to change. Again, back to your priorities. You have to be aware of the psychological factors. For a lot of people, stress, when they're stressed out, their food is my friend. And, I dealt with, I actually had a former superintendent who I think died early, but, we had a discussion and I was talking with him. He was obese, and we were sitting at a state championship football banquet, and the pecan pie was in front of him. And we had that, so I struck up a conversation. But what he told me was, he said, food is my friend. No matter how difficult my day is, at the end of the day, I can count on the food. And I tried to talk him out of that, but, that was his thing. He died of a heart attack early. I wish that I could have had more of an impact, but I think for a lot of people, food becomes a very psychological force. And you need to understand, what those psychological factors are. You need to stay hydrated. People who are hydrated, a lot of times when you think you're hungry, you're actually thirsty. You need to find positive alternatives to eating. Some people, it's like that becomes the thing that they do when they have nothing else to do. And people need to understand that food is an appetite stimulant. Decide ahead of time what your portions are, because once you start eating, your body tells you to eat more. And if you can get to where you understand that, then you say, okay, this is a good portion. When I get done eating this, then 20, 30 minutes later, when it finally gets to my brain, I will have felt like I've had enough to eat. So eat slower, take the time to reach the brain. Eliminate triggers and temptations. For a lot of people, it's every time I sit down to my computer, every time I sit in front of a TV, it's an automatic reflex that I have a bag of chips or whatever it is with it. So you got to eliminate those things that you find that are your triggers, are your temptations. Fad diets don't work. Okay, it's got to be a lifestyle decision as opposed to just, something that you change, for a month or two. Don't skip meals. Skipping meals slows down your metabolism. You need that energy in order to be able to continue. And understand a realistic time frame to see change. I work with people who will tell me that, okay, I want to lose in this amount of time. And the first question, well, how long did it take you to gain that weight? And I think you need to understand that if you go about it the right way, that it will take some time to come off. But if you do it that way, it's much more likely to stay off. And I've seen this quote before, but nothing tastes as good as feeling fit or being fit feels. And I think people need to understand that how you approach food. If you're always looking at it as something you crave, as opposed to looking at it in a different mental frame where it's like, okay, I can eat it in small quantities, but I don't need it in mass quantities, and how it'll affect you later on. When I talk with people, one of the things that I always, get frustrated with is people say that is how I am, as if there's personality traits that just you're born with and you can never change. And, for me, the next thing is no, that is how you choose to be. And I think everybody in education should have read Carol Dweck's Mindset. I think in the last 500 books I've read, she's probably been quoted 50 times. But I think it's important that you understand, the whole idea of, that it's not just, this is who I am, but you can really change a much more malleable mindset than what you have. Another good one, Andy Andrews is another good author, but, thinking beyond your boundaries. He kind of used the analogy of a kid's game where a kid, there was no rule for doing something different, but he did something different. He went outside of the boundaries to find a way of making things happen. I think so many times we live within, okay, this is how it's always been done, or this is how people do it, and so forth. Communication to me is one of the keys in life. Okay. And I think it's very important in terms of, communication is really, is something everyone should be working on. It should just be a part of who we are. But when I was early on, I would say as a teacher, I felt like communication was me talking. And what I realized when I got to a certain point, that really it's me listening. And as I become a better communicator, I learned that asking questions was a skill that I had to develop, where I would get people to start thinking about things based on the questions that I asked them. So rather than kind of telling people things, I would ask them things to get them to reach that point on their own. John Maxwell's got a lot of great books, leadership and so forth. Definitely a good author to read. Another teacher, coach, gave me a book on, it was actually a hostage negotiator. And when he was talking about communication, one of the things that it was pointed out in that book was, if you can get people to say, that's right, okay, it's different than you're right. If you just say you're right, it's one of those people kind of shutting you down. But if you get it to that's right, that means that you've done a good job of getting them to think differently. I think it's important that we learn how to understand that we've got to put ourselves in the shoes of the kids that we deal with. As an educator, you've got to realize that they have had different upbringings. They've had different things that have happened in their life, and that you've got to do things in a way that, really makes it to where you understand where they're coming from. One of the greatest tools I have is going up to a kid when I see him acting out and so forth and saying, are you having a bad day? You're usually very respectful to me. And what I have found that even kids who are not usually respectful to me, if you present it in that light, they're like, okay, they kind of take on that, and then they'll talk to you and they'll calm down. It'll be one of these things where, yeah, this happened, that happened. And then you can get into that conversation about, well, let's use this opportunity to kind of move forward from that. And you get into a conversation, a result of it. I think it's also important that when I'm dealing with students, I notice that if I tell them I have high expectations for them, it totally changes the conversation. If I say, I'm bringing you over here because I really believe in you, and I really believe that I think you can accomplish this, it changes the way that they look at themselves. It changes the way they look at you, and they're much more likely to hear what you have to say. I also think it's important to compliment effort, not ability. I think if you tell kids they're smart, if you tell kids they're athletic or whatever it is, that they will not want to challenge themselves in situations where they will not live up to that. But if you compliment effort and talk about being a hard worker, that's something they can bring to the table all the time. Discipline is a word some people have a difficult time with, but I really think that kids like situations where there's discipline. There's a comfort in disciplined situations. And I think it's important that you have a very structured, disciplined environment as an educator. But I also think you need to understand that what you allow is what will continue. When I see teachers or educators talking about the idea that, the kids are doing this, the kids are doing that. Well, to me, it's, instead of looking at it as a kid problem, you got to look at it as a teacher problem. What you're allowing will continue. So you have to understand that you set the culture and the vision. You're the enforcer of the standards. If you let the standards slip, that becomes the new standard. And I think we need to understand that you need to, we'd love to change the attitude of every kid you have coming in, but I think you have to change the behavior before you can change the attitude. So many times it's just a matter of putting kids in a situation where you're changing their behavior and they're able to look back and understand, what the rationale behind that is. But you need to tell them what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. And, kind of finishing up here, we all have stresses in our life. And I think the best visual for stresses is this jar filled with marbles. And when it gets to where it's overflowing, you don't function well. So you need to find a way of kind of eliminating those stresses in your life. And the first thing is baggage. This is a really good book on getting rid of baggage. Some people start with that jar half full because they're carrying around baggage they've had with them throughout their life. And then the most important conversation you have is the conversation you have with yourself. I think you need to make sure you understand that you have the ability to change the conversation that you have within your head. I think it's important that you stay organized. Lack of organization can be quite the stressor. I think, we talk to kids about regular sleep, but as adults, we don't always follow through with that. I think there are a lot of people that hit the snooze button 5 and 6 times. And I would just tell you this, that in terms of quality sleep, if you set the alarm for the time you need to get up and get in the habit of getting up at that time, your sleep will be much more refreshing. Be on time. People who are late tend to be stressed. And I would say this is an important point. I think we put out fires in life all the time, but some of the fires are just like a match being lit. It'll go out on its own. Doesn't really need a whole lot, but we have some people I know, especially, who every time a match is lit, they want to get out the fire hose. Save the fire hose for the important battles, the important fires that you need to put out in your life, and realize that some of the minor things are things you can let go. Learn to say no. Everybody wants to be a part of everything, help other people out, but there are times in life that you have to say no so that you can give the quality to the other people that you're dealing with. And, don't use finances as a stress. Find a way of budgeting in a way to where that becomes, because every little stress that you have in your life affects you as a person and how you deal with other people, how you deal with your profession, how you deal with your relationships. I've been in education I'm going into my 37th year. Okay. And I just want to point out that is a head behind my head. It's not a full-blown mullet, but these were the 80s. And what I would tell you is this: when I first started teaching, I was already 25 because I'd spent a few years out of college participating in flatwater kayaking on a national team. So I came in late. I was married. I had 2 children. On a starting teaching salary, I could not afford a car, according to a teacher's credit union. That's what I started out with. When we just had 1 car for a period of time, when I was getting ready to have my 3rd child, my wife actually had to drive to my school so that I could take her to the hospital. But I would say this, when people talk about educators not being paid enough and so forth, I would not change my life in any way. In the 36 years that I've been in education, I feel like I have the most important job in the world. I feel like it's a job that I feel that when I get to the end, when I finally do decide to call it quits, that I will have left a legacy, that there will things that I have accomplished and people that I've impacted. So I would say, look at your job in a way to where when you get to the end, you want to be able to look at it in those terms. I would also say this: when you start your day of work, go about work the same way as this 2-year-old experiencing his first Halloween. Okay. If you go out and with that kind of energy and that kind of enthusiasm, life is much more, enjoyable. And again, the conference evaluation and presenter evaluation, I was told to put this at the end. As an old guy, I have no idea how this works and why there's little Scantron things, but I'm hoping that somebody's going to jump in and explain the rest here. I have not, through sharing my PowerPoint, haven't seen chat. So if there have been questions along the way, I apologize. I haven't seen any of those, and I didn't click something I should have clicked, but I appreciate the fact that you selected this time slot to listen to me. My email is out there, but if there's the PowerPoint itself is in the SCED if you want to get that and look back at some of the quotes or some of the books. But I am always available. I've got time for questions if there is time here. I'd be glad to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Mr. Vanderbush, thank you very much for the presentation. This is my 2nd time hearing it, and it gets better every time. So on behalf of everybody, thank you very much. So yeah, we have some time. So if there's any questions, if you want to drop it in the chat box, I can moderate that. Or if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, feel free to. The presenter and the conference evaluation links are on the screen for those of you guys with phones. If you go to your camera and just zoom in on it, it'll pick it up and it'll take you right to it. So we'll open this up for questions and then we'll shut it down. Thank you so much.
This is Rick. I have a question. I missed the beginning, so I didn't hear what happened to your oldest son, but what do you think losing a child did for you as a teacher, both to maybe help you be a stronger teacher and if in any way created obstacles for you as a teacher?
Oh, it's one of those things that my son had a brain aneurysm. So it was one of those, it was a sudden type thing. Happened 8 years ago. As you can imagine, quite difficult. But what I've tried to do is use that in a way to where I look at the opportunity as my son making me a better teacher, better person, and so forth. So, one of the things you learn to value life much more, and there's some things that you do differently. But for me, in terms of a teacher and as an educator, it has allowed me to have a better understanding of the difficulties that kids face. Because in our school district, there's a lot of kids that are dealing with loss. They've dealt with siblings, relatives, and so forth. That it gives me an opportunity to talk to them in a way to where I can say, okay, this is what I experienced, and they listen to me on a different level. Having been that, okay, you've experienced something like that, it's suddenly not that, well, you don't know how I feel. It's more like, okay, this is somebody who knows how I feel, and it opens up the conversation. But, having any type of tragedy, I think, helps you deal with other tragedies with people. It allows you to, kind of look at life in a way to where you understand the most difficult thing that you think could possibly happen to you is still something you can get through and that you can move forward with. You can change how you view it. You can change, how you approach life. But, I'm not the type that as a result of that worries that another one, I have 4 children, another one will die or worried about anything like that, because it's one of those things where worrying, about the safety of my kids and all that wouldn't have changed what happened, wouldn't have made it any easier to deal with. So, kind of it's helped me in terms of being a counselor, being, to teachers, to students. So I really think there are so many times in life that tragedies can actually make us, a better person.
Thank you.